And so then we read what is arguably the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. So literally what that means, if you want to be woodenly literal, it's you will not have any other gods in my face. The word for God's face is usually translated in English as God's presence. Right? So if we use that standard translation, it's like, you will have no other gods in my presence, in the place where I am. Right? You will have no other gods. It is interesting and important to point out just how common that phrase about the face of God is in the Old Testament. Every time it talks about God's presence, it's actually the face of God. Right? So when Jonah gets up and flees, it says he flees from the face of God. Right? When priests are going to serve for the tabernacle or the temple, they're coming before the face of God. Right? The face of the God who nobody has seen. So there's this constant tension in the Hebrew idiom. It's going to become important in a few chapters because we're going to talk about God speaking to Moses face to face. And then 9 verses after it says that, God's going to say to Moses, no one can see my face and live. And you're going to go, right? So there's this tension about the face of God, right, that gets kind of covered over, right? But so notice, this isn't saying no other gods exist. This isn't saying there aren't any, the things that the nations are worshiping don't exist. They're not demons. They're not whatever. They're imaginary. Right? We've already talked about it before. We already saw that when God said he was going to judge all the gods of Egypt. Right? We talked a little about that. But he's saying, you don't bring any of them into my presence. Right? You can't worship God alongside these other things. Right? Alongside these other things. And this is where all kinds of applications come. Right? So like, what does Christ say? No man can serve 2 masters. He's not talking about polygamy there. He says, no man can serve 2 masters. You'll love one and hate the other. Or hate one and love the other. You can't serve God and mammon. Right? That serve there is talking about this. Right? Service, worship. Right? Now, this is important. Right? Because we often have in our heads, right, when we think about this commandment, right? Well, I don't worship Zeus. Right? Like, I don't worship the Hindu gods. Right? But there's a different temptation here, right? This is not a commandment about, right, like people who worship the true God are good and everybody else is bad. This is about whether our loyalties are divided. Whether our loyalty and faithfulness to God is divided with something else. Right, with something else. And Christ, for example, takes this to an extreme in a few places in the New Testament that aren't popular verses to read. Right? Like when he says, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Right? And we think that's pretty harsh. And then you read the same stuff in St. Luke's gospel and he says, unless you hate your father and your mother. Right? And you're like, what? Right? Like, it's even that, right? Like, you can't have divided loyalties. Right? That's what this commandment is about. And this is something that's really hard for modern people. Right? Because think about all the times we take our Christian faith and, shall we say, nuance it based on other factors. Right? well, I'm a Christian, but my son or my daughter or my brother or my sister does X, Y, Z. Right? So do we say, well, I love that person, but what they're doing is wrong? Or do we say, well, no, I mean, that's not really wrong. Right? When we do that, we're loving that other person, right? And we're putting that not only alongside, but kind of above, right? Our loyalty to what God has said and what we should do, right? Or I know there's all that stuff in the Gospels about camels going through the eyes of needles and, not trying to serve God and mammon, but, a guy's got to make a living, and, we are in a capitalist society, and my investments are doing really well right now, and right? And so we sort of nuance, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, it's like, when I get rich, God's blessing me, right? Like, right? There's a lot of nuancing, right, that happens. And it's always our Christian faith that gets kind of bent and warped, rather than us bending how we think about things or bending what we do or, right? Sacrificing something else, we just sort of move our faith around. So we do it a little more subtly, right? It was very unsubtle in the Old Testament. They build an altar to Yahweh, then they build an altar to Baal right next to it, and that's pretty unsubtle, right? But we do the same thing, just in very more subtle, clever, nuanced ways, right? So that we can pretend we're not doing it, because it's not as gross and in your face.